When the Great War ended, the world moved on, and the Norfolk Regiment's disappearance was filed away as an unfortunate mystery, one of many tragedies swallowed by history. But not everyone forgot. Hidden inside the War Office in London, a handful of researchers continued to ask the forbidden question: what if those soldiers hadn't died, but had simply vanished from our plane of reality? In 1939, as another war loomed over Europe, that same question resurfaced. This time, in laboratories filled with electricity, metal, and fear. War had become a race not of courage, but of science. And in the shadows, science was preparing to cross a line humanity wasn't ready for. Among those scientists was Dr. Wilhelm Reuter, a German physicist obsessed with light manipulation and electromagnetic resonance. Reuter had once studied in Britain, where he gained access to old wartime reports, including one classified under a single word: Norfolk. The file spoke of a dense, luminous fog that defied explanation. To Reuter, it wasn't superstition, it was data. He believed that the British battalion had stumbled into a field of altered electromagnetic frequency, a field capable of bending visible light and disrupting molecular structure. In simple terms, he thought the soldiers had turned invisible. Not by magic, but by physics. By 1940, under the Nazi war machine, Reuter's theories attracted the attention of Hermann, Göring's research division. He was ordered to recreate the phenomenon. Deep beneath a bunker in Dresden, his team began an experiment, known internally as Project Nabel, Project Fog. They started with animals, small ones at first, rabbits, then dogs. Electric coils surrounded a reinforced chamber while oscillators pulsed, electromagnetic waves in rhythmic bursts. For a few seconds, the animals inside seemed to shimmer, their outlines blurring as if submerged in water. Then they vanished completely. When the current stopped, they reappeared, but not all alive. Some were burned, others fused with the metal floor of the chamber. Reuter's notes described it coldly. Physical displacement achieved, molecular stability compromised. Word of the project reached Berlin, and rumors began to spread that the Germans had found a way to cloak entire machines from enemy detection. It was propaganda gold. But Reuter's research wasn't about radar. It was about something far deeper, the manipulation of reality itself. Meanwhile, across the ocean, the Americans were running their own classified programs. At the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, scientists under the Office of Naval Research were experimenting with magnetic field generators to make ships invisible to radar. One of those ships, the USS Eldridge, would later become the centerpiece of one of the most controversial military stories in history. The connection between Reuter's Project Fog and the Philadelphia experiment has never been officially proven, but the timing was too perfect. Both projects started months apart. Both focused on electromagnetic cloaking, and both resulted in the same horror. Test subjects disappearing and returning changed. In 1943, Reuter's final recorded experiment took place under the code name Operation Eisenlicht, Iron Light. Eyewitnesses later claimed the entire laboratory was engulfed in a pulsating sphere of light. When the energy field collapsed, the lab was empty. Every scientist, every assistant, every piece of equipment gone. Only a blackened ring remained on the concrete floor, and the smell of ozone hung in the air. The official explanation? An accidental explosion. But the internal memo filed by an SS officer told a different story. Personnel and material missing, no trace. Energy readings off measurable scale. That file, stamped top secret, was buried in Berlin until the final days of the war. When Berlin fell in 1945, the ruins of the city were filled with ghosts, not just of people, but of knowledge. Entire departments of science had been erased overnight. Files burned, prototypes destroyed, names vanished. Yet among the wreckage, Allied intelligence officers stumbled upon something that made their blood run cold. In an underground chamber outside Dresden, they found the remains of a laboratory. Black scorch marks circled the floor like a ritual. On one wall, half-melted metal shelves still clung to life. And on one of those shelves, they discovered a single folder, charred but intact, stamped Project Nabel. Inside were sketches of electromagnetic coils, calculations written in Reuter's hand, Benkis Distetaduzrin, and a photograph dated August 12, 1915. The same day, the Norfolk Battalion had vanished in Gallipoli. At the bottom of the photo, a note read, "Energy anomaly. Resonance pattern identical to Norfolk Field." The British intelligence team that reviewed the document knew immediately what it meant. The phenomenon that consumed 267 men in 1915 was the same one the Germans had tried to replicate 3 decades later. And maybe they had succeeded. The folder was flown to London, then quickly reclassified under a new name, Operation Mist. It would never appear in public record again. But decades later, fragments of it surfaced through declassified military archives. They revealed that the British and Americans had quietly continued Reuter's work, this time under the justification of radar research. But deep inside those projects, something darker was happening. The reports spoke of biological instability and psychological collapse in human subjects. Some described test subjects who vanished for seconds and came back reporting that they could see sound and hear light. Others came back screaming that they were still inside the field, even when standing in front of their observers. None of this was ever supposed to reach daylight. But science, once born, refuses to die. Every nation that captured pieces of Reuter's research wanted to claim it and control it. Because if invisibility could be harnessed, it meant power beyond imagination. By 1946, rumors of a disappearing ship began circulating among dock workers in the United States. At first, it sounded like drunken gossip, but then came the witnesses, sailors who spoke in whispers about a test gone wrong, a destroyer that had vanished and reappeared hundreds of miles away. The U.S. Navy denied it all, but declassified documents decades later revealed that there were indeed experiments involving intense magnetic fields at the Penn, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Satistai, Estitati, Benamin. Their purpose, officially, was to make ships undetectable to radar. Unofficially, they were testing how far matter could be displaced without destruction. One photograph in particular, buried in the archives, shows a ship surrounded by thick mist, glowing faintly as if suspended in static. On the back, a handwritten note reads, "Energy resonance, 08-1243, the same day that Reuter's laboratory in Dresden disappeared." Coincidence again? Or a thread connecting 2 continents, 2 wars, and 1 forbidden science? The American program became known as Project Rainbow. The Germans had called theirs Project Fog. Different names. Same goal, to bend light, bend reality, and win a war that could never be won. But something had gone wrong. Both projects ended the same way, with men disappearing, machines fused into solid metal, and witnesses left half insane. One sailor who claimed to have survived the Philadelphia test said this before his death in 953. "We weren't invisible. We were somewhere else. We saw things no human should see. What those things were remains unknown. But whatever they were, they terrified every government that came close to uncovering the truth." By the 1950s, every trace of the invisibility experiments was sealed away under Cold War secrecy. Scientists involved were relocated, silenced, or vanished under mysterious circumstances. And yet, one British archivist later confessed in an interview, "The Norfolk file never left London. We reopened it twice, once during the Blitz, and again after Philadelphia," meaning the vanished battalion was more than just a story of lost soldiers. It was the blueprint for a new era of warfare, one that blurred the line between science and nightmare. The mystery of invisibility didn't end with the war. It only went deeper underground. And what started with a silver fog in 1915 would become the foundation for technologies we still don't fully understand today. In 1945, as Europe fell silent and the guns of war finally ceased, the Allied forces began sifting through what was left of the Nazi Empire. Among the ruins of Berlin lay a mountain of secrets. Scientific notes, hidden experiments, entire departments erased from history. In a half-collapsed bunker near Tempelhof, a British officer discovered a sealed crate labeled Project Nebel Eisenlicht. Inside were half-burned documents, warped metal rings, and a roll of undeveloped film. It was shipped to London under direct orders from military intelligence. Months later, when the images were developed, investigators were stunned. The photos showed not soldiers, not weapons, but what appeared to be a massive sphere of light, swallowing a concrete chamber whole. The energy distortion was identical to the fog described in the WW2 Norfolk case of 1915. Within days, the British War Office reactivated the Norfolk file. For the first time in 30 years, the case of the vanished battalion was reopened. A team of scientists, including one American advisor from the Philadelphia Project, was assigned to examine both the Norfolk and Dresden materials. Their conclusion was chilling. The same resonance pattern appeared in both incidents, the same energy frequency, separated by decades and by continents. They called it Event Signature Delta 1915. But when the report reached higher command, it was immediately stamped, classified, no further distribution. Officially, the file didn't exist. Unofficially, it became the cornerstone of a new research initiative, Project Tempest. The goal was simple and terrifying: to understand, reproduce, and weaponize the same field that had made men disappear. Across the next decade, rumors spread among soldiers and technicians. Stories of secret hangars in rural England, of lights that bent shadows, of brooms that made you feel like you weren't fully there. One test subject wrote in his journal, "I could see my hand fade like smoke. When I moved, I heard my own thoughts echo in the walls." Those notes were later confiscated. The man was never seen again. The public never knew about Project Tempest. But strange reports began to surface in the early 1950s. Civilian pilots spotting invisible clouds of energy, villagers describing luminous fogs that made compasses spin, and soldiers guarding testing zones that glowed faintly at night. Every time, the government called it weather. But inside the War Office, scientists were beginning to fear that the fog wasn't just an experiment. It was a living phenomenon, one that could appear on its own. In 1945, as Europe fell silent and the guns of war finally ceased, the Allied forces began sifting through what was left of the Nazi Empire. Among the ruins of Berlin lay a mountain of secrets. Scientific notes, hidden experiments, entire departments erased from history. In a half-collapsed bunker near Tempelhof, a British officer discovered a sealed crate labeled Project Nebel Eisenlicht. Inside were half-burned documents, warped metal rings, and a roll of undeveloped film. It was shipped to London under direct orders from military intelligence. Months later, when the images were developed, investigators were stunned. The photos showed not soldiers, not weapons, but what appeared to be a massive sphere of light, swallowing a concrete chamber whole. The energy distortion was identical to the fog described in the WW2 Norfolk case of 1915. Within days, the British War Office reactivated the Norfolk file. For the first time in 30 years, the case of the vanished battalion was reopened. A team of scientists, including one American advisor from the Philadelphia Project, was assigned to examine both the Norfolk and Dresden materials. Their conclusion was chilling. The same resonance pattern appeared in both incidents, the same energy frequency, separated by decades and by continents. They called it Event Signature Delta 1915. But when the report reached higher command, it was immediately stamped, classified, no further distribution. Officially, the file didn't exist. Unofficially, it became the cornerstone of a new research initiative, Project Tempest. The goal was simple and terrifying: to understand, reproduce, and weaponize the same field that had made men disappear. Across the next decade, rumors spread among soldiers and technicians. Stories of secret hangars in rural England, of lights that bent shadows, of brooms that made you feel like you weren't fully there. One test subject wrote in his journal, "I could see my hand fade like smoke. When I moved, I heard my own thoughts echo in the walls." Those notes were later confiscated. The man was never seen again. The public never knew about Project Tempest. But strange reports began to surface in the early 1950s. Civilian pilots spotting invisible clouds of energy, villagers describing luminous fogs that made compasses spin, and soldiers guarding testing zones that glowed faintly at night. Every time, the government called it weather. But inside the War Office, scientists were beginning to fear that the fog wasn't just an experiment. It was a living phenomenon, one that could appear on its own. By 1953, Project Tempest was officially shut down. The files were sealed, the laboratories dismantled, and the scientists reassigned to civilian programs. But those who had worked on it knew better. The energy field had never been fully contained. In the final experiment, something unexpected occurred. A generator malfunctioned, creating a magnetic surge that rippled far beyond the facility's boundaries. For 11 minutes, radio stations across southern England went silent. Cameras failed, watches stopped, and 3 researchers standing near the core vanished. When power returned, the entire facility was covered in frost, as if the temperature had dropped below zero in seconds. No explosion, no fire, just stillness. The project was erased from public record. The deaths were listed as industrial accident, but the data recovered from that last test was unlike anything seen before. It suggested that the electromagnetic resonance did not simply bend light, it bent space, and perhaps time. A surviving engineer later confessed to a journalist decades later, "They didn't disappear. They moved sideways, not forward or back, but sideways, into somewhere else." After that, governments across the world quietly agreed to ban all large-scale electromagnetic displacement tests. But secrecy doesn't erase truth. It only buries it deeper. Over the following years, declassified memos revealed that fragments of the Norfolk data were shared with American defense programs, the same ones that years later would evolve into energy field and stealth technology research, modern cloaking devices, radar jammers, and optical camouflage. All trace their conceptual roots to one event: the fog that consumed the Norfolk Regiment in 1915. The official story remains unchanged. The battalion was lost in combat. But the data says otherwise, because in the early 2000s, British historians re-examined the Gallipoli Valley using ground-penetrating radar. What they found still puzzles science. The soil carried an unexplained magnetic pattern, identical to the readings taken in Dresden in 1943, and on a single stone at the site, barely visible under a century of erosion. Someone had carved 2 words, faint, almost erased by time. Still here. The war had ended. The world rebuilt itself. But beneath the calm surface of peace, silence had a cost. Files that should have been public were buried deep under classified vaults. Those who asked questions about Project Fog or the Norfolk case were met with polite smiles and locked doors. By the late 1950s, only a few scientists dared to speak. One of them was Dr. Harold Baines, a retired physicist who had worked for the British Army during the war. In an interview given to a small academic journal, he described an experiment conducted in 1915 that altered visual perception through electromagnetic harmonics. When asked if it was related to the vanished battalion, he said only one phrase: "They were the first." 2 weeks later, Dr. Baines was found dead in his home. His notes and recordings were gone. The official report: heart failure. But colleagues claimed his apartment had been ransacked, his papers missing, his typewriter smashed. Rumors spread fast in the scientific underground. There were whispers of a suppression network, a special branch of intelligence dedicated to silencing anyone who got too close to the truth behind electromagnetic displacement. The story was dismissed as paranoia, but a curious pattern emerged. At least 6 researchers who studied light resonance anomalies between 1950 and 1965 vanished without a trace. One of them disappeared in broad daylight on his way to a lecture in Geneva. His car was found parked, engine running, driver's door open. He was never seen again. Meanwhile, technology was advancing faster than ever. Radars, satellites, particle accelerators, machines capable of generating stronger electromagnetic fields than anything known during the war. And yet, every time one of those machines malfunctioned, technicians described the same phenomenon: a sudden drop in temperature, a strange distortion in the air, and in rare cases, a fog that appeared where no fog should exist. In 1967, a group of physicists at the University of Cambridge detected a spike in energy during a classified experiment. Their instruments recorded a short burst of radiation identical to the readings found in the Norfolk files from 1915. The resemblance was mathematically impossible, a perfect match across half a century. The team's lead scientist wrote in his private notes, "We may be repeating an event that already happened before we understood it." That notebook was seized the next morning. By the 1970s, governments had a new word for phenomena like this: spatial anomalies. It sounded harmless, academic, but it was a way to speak about something terrifying without naming it. Across NATO and the Soviet Union, classified programs investigated how light and gravity might interact under extreme magnetic fields. Theories that once belonged to science fiction were now whispered behind the closed doors of military research. In 1979, a leaked report from the United States Department of Defense made a chilling reference to non-local field resonances and unintended displacement of biological matter. The same year, a maintenance crew near Suffolk, England, reported seeing a grey curtain hovering above the ground during a radar calibration test. When they approached, one man vanished for nearly 15 seconds. When he reappeared, he was shaking uncontrollably. He said it was silent, too silent, and that the world looked inverted, like a reflection inside a mirror. The report was sealed. The men were relocated, and once again the phrase "industrial malfunction" appeared on the paperwork. It was clear the phenomenon was still happening, not as myth, not as legend, but as a recurring effect of technology itself. By the end of the Cold War, hundreds of files had been locked away under black projects, buried in data centers that don't officially exist. And yet, fragments have surfaced through Freedom of Information leaks. Images of distorted aircraft, blurred soldiers, and fields that shimmer with invisible energy. Modern physicists now call it quantum decoherence, the collapse of matter's stability when forced into extreme resonance. But that term doesn't comfort the families of those who vanished. It only gives their loss a new name. Today, the official stance of every government remains the same. No evidence of electromagnetic displacement in historical records. But those who've studied the Norfolk disappearance, the Dresden laboratory, and the Philadelphia project know that the pattern is undeniable. The fog wasn't just weather. It was a doorway, one that humankind opened without understanding, and one that might never truly close. Because somewhere in a forgotten archive, under dust and silence, a file still waits, stamped in fading ink, on Norfolk classified phenomenon recurring. A century has passed since the men of the Norfolk Regiment marched into the fog and never came back. Yet their story refuses to fade. It lives quietly in archives, in whispers between scientists, and in the unspoken fears of those who've studied what happens when light itself bends too far. In 2015, exactly 100 years after the disappearance, a team of British and Turkish historians conducted a joint expedition to Gallipoli. Their mission was to locate any remaining artifacts of the Norfolk Battalion: buttons, weapons, traces of camp remains, anything at all. What they found instead was something stranger. At the coordinates listed in the original report, the metal detectors malfunctioned, compasses spun in circles, cameras froze, and when one of the researchers extended a hand into the air, the static charge was so intense that his hair lifted. Seconds later, a low hum filled the valley, a vibration just below human hearing. It lasted 30 seconds. Then, silence. When the team reviewed their equipment later, They found that every digital timestamp from that half hour was missing. The devices had recorded nothing, as if time itself had stopped. The lead researcher, Dr. Elaine Ward, wrote in her personal notes, "The valley feels wrong. It doesn't echo. It absorbs sound. And at night we hear whispers that aren't wind." Her report was never published. The university quietly ended its funding, but the data remains archived, hidden, in a folder labeled Anomalous Environmental Signatures, Gallipoli. Meanwhile, across the world, sightings of luminous fog continued. Pilots over the Atlantic reported flying through silver clouds that disrupted their instruments. In 1992, a Soviet naval engineer claimed that a submarine vanished from radar for 11 minutes and reappeared 40 kilometers away. The description of the event, glowing mist, freezing temperature, static buildup, matched perfectly with the 1915 and 1943 incidents. Different countries, different eras, same phenomenon. And still, the same silence from those who know more than they say. Today, the mystery of the vanished battalion has become more than a war story. It's a mirror reflecting humanity's endless hunger for control, for power over what we don't understand. Modern physics now speaks of parallel realities, quantum tunneling, and the possibility that space itself is woven with unseen threads. Threads that, if pulled too hard, might unravel what we call reality. When scientists talk about spatial distortion fields, they're describing the same thing soldiers in 1915 saw with their own eyes. The language changed, but the phenomenon remained. Technology simply gave it new names: resonance, harmonic frequency, field collapse. In 2020, during an experimental test of high-frequency lasers in France, a research facility recorded a flash of light that appeared to bend inward, as if space itself folded for a fraction of a second. Every clock in the room stopped at 3:17 p.m. The security footage turned white, and for a full minute, the recording showed nothing but static fog. When the systems came back, one of the researchers was found unconscious. He later described hearing voices speaking backwards and seeing a field of light with shadows moving inside it. He couldn't explain it. No one could. It was logged as a magnetic discharge incident and then quietly sealed, but the pattern continues. From the fog of Gallipoli to the labs of modern Europe, the same energy hums beneath the surface. Waiting, pulsing, watching. The vanished battalion isn't just a story about soldiers lost to history. It's a warning that some discoveries shouldn't be made too early, and that curiosity, in the wrong hands, can open doors we don't yet know how to close. And maybe, just maybe, those men from 1915 never truly died. Maybe they're still marching, somewhere between light and shadow, trapped in a place where time forgot to move. Their footsteps echo across a century, and the fog still waits for the next who dares to enter.